In the spring of 2009, a food broker named Dale Fitch drove out to a sheep and cattle operation in Custer County, Nebraska, and stood in the farmyard with a clipboard against his hip and told a rancher named Gus Hamlin that what he was doing with the bones was not a business. Fitch was 44 years old, had worked regional food distribution for 19 years, had a degree from the University of Nebraska, and the particular patience of a man who believed he was being kind. He looked at the stack of femurs and knuckle joints and trotters drying in the open air beside the barn, at the 60-quart stock pots already blackening with use on the outdoor burners, at the mason jars cooling in rows on a folding table, and he said, with genuine concern in his voice, that this was a cottage operation at best and a liability at worst, and that the supermarket buyers he worked with were not going to spend floor space on what amounted to a hobby. He was not wrong by the standards he carried. He was simply measuring the wrong thing. 11 years later, in the fall of 2020, a purchasing manager for a Whole Foods market named Claire Dean called Gus Hamlin's operation from a regional office in Kansas City and offered a shelf placement contract for 14 stores in the Rocky Mountain region. The number on the first purchase order was $312,000. It was not the end of the story. It was the place where Gus set the phone down on the kitchen table and stood at the window for a while, looking at nothing in particular, and his healer Moss got up from the floor and pressed against his leg, because that is what Moss did when something changed in the room. This is the story of the 11 years between those two moments. If you have ever watched someone build something patient and plain out of what the world considered waste, stay with us. We are going to tell you what Gus knew about bones that Dale Fitch did not, and we are going to show you the mechanism, because the mechanism is the whole point. Gus Hamlin was 51 years old in 2009, known in Custer County for two things: the discipline of his fencing and the silence in which he worked. He ran 340 acres of mixed grass pasture outside of Broken Bow, Nebraska, carrying a small cow-calf herd and a modest flock of hair sheep that other ranchers treated as an eccentricity. The land had belonged to his father, and before that to his father's father, who had homesteaded it in 1911 with a team, a spring-tooth harrow, and a particular stubbornness about root systems. The house was the same house his grandfather had built. Gus had replaced the plumbing and the windows, but nothing else he was not forced to replace. The truck in the lane was a 1987 Ford F-25O that he had rebuilt twice. The bones had been coming since 1999. That was when a small USDA-inspected slaughter facility 6 miles down the county road started leaving what the trade called offal byproduct at the gate, rather than hauling it to the rendering plant in Kearney. The facility's owner, a quiet man named Pete Voss, had known Gus's father and continued the relationship by habit, and by the understanding, unstated, that Gus would use what was left rather than let it spoil. For the first 8 years, Gus used the bones as his grandfather had, cracking them and simmering them with whatever garden vegetables were oversupply, and fed the resulting liquid to the calves when they were weaned, and to himself when the winter came on hard, and gave Mason jars of it to his sister Nora in Anselmo when she asked. Nora asked often. She told people it was better than anything in a store, and nobody paid that particular comment much attention. Let me tell you about bones, because most of what the food system knew in 2009 was wrong about them, or more precisely, incomplete. A beef knuckle joint or a femur shaft is not primarily a calcium deposit. It is a collagen delivery system. The bone itself is roughly 30% protein by dry weight, and most of that protein is collagen, the structural scaffold that holds connective tissue together across a mammal's entire body, When you simmer a bone in water at a temperature between 185 and 205 degrees Fahrenheit for a sustained period, which is to say 8 hours at minimum and 24 or more for the densest joints, you are doing something specific to that collagen. You are denaturing it. The heat breaks the triple helix structure of the collagen molecule, and what comes out of solution is gelatin, a hydrolyzed protein that, when cooled, sets the liquid into something between a broth and a soft gel. The test for a properly made bone broth is simple. You refrigerate a jar, and if it jiggles like panna cotta, when you tilt it, you have broken the collagen correctly. If it stays liquid, you have made soup stock. The distinction matters because the gelatin is where the nutritional density lives, and the difference in production time between the two is the difference between a commodity and something that cannot be replaced. Gus's grandmother had known this, though she never used the word collagen. She called it the set. She told Gus's father that a broth worth keeping was one that set in the cold, and she had written that principle in the back of a composition notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer beside the stove, along with her notes on rendering lard, curing hams, and the particular ratio of fat to lean that made a sausage worth smoking. The notebook was 40 years old when Gus began reading it seriously. He had read it before, but in 2001, 2 years into the bone supply from Pete Voss's facility, he read it the way you read something when you are trying to understand a process rather than remember a recipe. The mechanism was there. His grandmother had described it in practical terms. Simmer long enough to set, skim the fat from the surface, salt only after cooling, seal the jar hot. She had not described it as a product. She had described it as knowledge. Dale Fitch's clipboard visit in the spring of 2009 arrived at what was, from the outside, a reasonable moment of concern. Gus had by then been selling mason jars out of a cooler at the Broken Bow Farmers Market for 3 years, priced at $4 a quart, and was moving perhaps 60 jars on a good Saturday. He had also begun approaching the 2 natural food retailers in Grand Island and the health food co-op in Kearney, none of which had responded with anything beyond polite disinterest. To a food broker surveying the landscape, it looked exactly like what Fitch said it was, a local curiosity, undersized and underlabeled, with no refrigerated distribution chain, no liability insurance beyond a basic farm policy, and no market category. The term bone broth did not exist yet in grocery retail. The USDA had no standard of identity for it. Fitch was not confused about the market as it stood in 2009. He was unable to see what the market was about to become, or why Gus's particular method was positioned to be there when it arrived. The man Gus watched most closely in those years was not Fitch. It was his neighbor Ed Kurtz, who farmed 380 acres adjacent to Gus's east fence line and ran a commercial cow-calf operation on a slightly larger scale. Ed was a good faith operator and a careful student of extension recommendations. He had attended every soil health meeting in the county for a decade and had adopted the practices the University of Nebraska recommended with consistency and diligence. In 2007, he had financed a 40-foot articulated sprayer at $138,000 on a 7-year note to manage his weed pressure more efficiently. In 2009, he was carrying $94,000 in total equipment debt against a cattle operation whose per hundredweight margins had averaged $18 over the preceding 3 years. The debt was manageable. The margins were real. The system was functioning exactly as designed. Gus had no equipment debt. He had never had equipment debt. The sprayer in his shed was a pull-behind he had owned for 22 years. His margins on cattle were slightly lower than Ed's because he ran a smaller herd, But his cost per cow was lower because he did not finance inputs. What Gus had that Ed did not was a secondary revenue stream that cost him nothing but time. The bones from Pete Voss's facility arrived free of charge, and the propane and water and mason jars required to process them, which together ran to perhaps 38 cents per quart in direct input cost at his 2009 production volume. He was selling each quart for $4. He was not getting rich. He was getting margin that the cattle operation alone could not provide, and he was building a customer list, one jar at a time, with the same patience he brought to everything else. If you have ever driven past a farm sale in Nebraska and wondered what quiet looks like from the outside, come back to this story at the midpoint, because what Gus was doing in those years was not visually dramatic. He was cooking. He was washing jars. He was driving 60 miles to a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in a truck that burned a little oil, and coming home 60 miles in the afternoon with an empty cooler and a zipper pouch of cash. He was doing this every weekend from May through October, and several weekends in the off-season when the indoor market ran in Kearney. He was also doing everything else a small cattle and sheep operation requires, which is to say he was not sleeping much and was not complaining about it. If you have ever kept at something for years without visible evidence that it was leading anywhere in particular, leave us a comment below, because Gus's story is for you, and we are not done yet. In 2011, a woman named Vera Lind opened a natural food store in Broken Bow. She was 38, had spent a decade in Austin, Texas, working in specialty food retail, and had returned to Custer County to be near her mother. She had opinions about product quality that she did not soften for politeness, and when Gus brought her 6 jars of broth on a Tuesday morning in October of that year, she opened one of them in the back room, warmed it in a small saucepan on a hot plate, and stood there tasting it for longer than Gus had expected. She did not speak for approximately 45 seconds. Then she said, "This sets." It was not a question. "Yes," Gus said. "Everything sets." She said she would take 12 jars a week to start, at $5.50 per quart, and that if he could give her consistency of gel strength, she would raise the order. He asked what she meant by consistency of gel strength. She told him to look up Brick's testing for gelatine concentration and come back when he had a refractometer. He did not know what a refractometer was. He drove home and read about it that evening and ordered one from a supply catalog in Omaha for $34 and used it every batch thereafter. Let me tell you what Vera understood that the regional food distribution system did not. By 2011, the earliest wave of what would eventually be called the ancestral diet movement was circulating in specialty health food markets, primarily online and in coastal urban stores. And it centered on the idea that traditionally prepared animal foods, specifically organ meats, fermented dairy, and long-simmered bone broths, carried nutritional profiles that industrial food processing destroyed. The argument was not yet mainstream. It was a niche driven by a few practitioners and a larger readership of people who had grown up in rural families and associated the particular density of homemade stock with a kind of health they could not get from a carton. The problem was supply. Nobody was making bone broth that met the quality standard the movement required, meaning long simmer time, bones sourced from pasture-raised animals, high gel strength, no added flavoring, no MSG, no thickeners. The cartons of stock on the grocery shelf were not bone broth by any practical definition. They were flavored water. Gus's broth was not flavored water. It was 22 to 26 hours of simmering on a correctly managed fire using knuckle and femur bones from cattle and sheep that had spent their lives on mixed grass pasture and been processed at a USDA-certified facility 6 miles from where the bones were cooled. The gelatin concentration, which Gus now measured with Vera's refractometer protocol, was consistently between 12 and 16 bricks in the sheep broth and between 9 and 13 bricks in the cattle broth. These numbers meant the broth set firmly enough to slice when cold, which is a quality no commercial stock achieved, and few home cooks had the patience to make themselves. Vera knew what those numbers meant. Gus had learned what they meant. Most of the food distribution system had no category for the conversation. The years between 2012 and 2016 were the years of accumulation. Gus added a second outdoor burner setup and increased his production to 300 jars per week at peak season. He drove his route every week, stopping at Vera's store in Broken Bow, a natural foods co-op in Kearney, a health-focused grocer in Grand Island, and 2 farmers markets. His refrigerated transport was a second-hand cooler mounted in the truck bed, lined with frozen water jugs he made himself. The label on his jars was designed by Nora's daughter, Meg, who was studying graphic design in Lincoln, and it was simple and readable, showing the name of his operation, Hamlin Ranch Broth, the cut of bone, the animal, the simmer time in hours, and the bricks reading. No health claims, no marketing language. The bricks reading on a broth label was unusual enough in 2012 that 2 buyers, who later stocked his product, said it was the first thing that told them they were looking at something different. Ed Kurtz bought a second financed implement in the spring of 2014, a front-end loader attachment for the tractor at $22,000, bringing his total equipment note to $97,000 after partial paydown. Pasture-to-plate beef prices had softened that year, and his per hundredweight margin had dropped to $14. The operation was still sound by conventional measures. The debt-to-asset ratio was within what his lender at Farmers State Bank considered acceptable. Dale Fitch visited Ed that same spring, as he did most producers in the region, and told him prices would recover and that the fundamentals of the commercial cattle operation were solid. Fitch believed this. He had data to support it. He was not wrong about the data. In 2015, Dale Fitch stopped at Gus's gate on his way back from Ed's place. He was not there on a formal call. He had driven past the farm a dozen times in the preceding 6 years, and had always thought of that clipboard visit in 2009 with the mild, comfortable distance of a man who has said a reasonable thing and moved on. He stopped because he had seen a mention of Hamlin Ranch Broth in a specialty food trade newsletter from Denver, and curiosity had pulled him off the county road. He asked Gus what his production volume looked like. Gus said he was running about 350 jars per week, averaged across the year. Fitch said that was interesting, and that the market had moved. Gus said yes. Fitch said he might have dismissed it too quickly in 2009, and that he could open some doors if Gus was interested in a regional distribution. Gus said he would think about it. He was polite, and he thanked Fitch for stopping, and he did not call him back because his cost structure at the direct retail level was producing margins that regional distribution would have without guaranteeing the volume to compensate. The first sign of the structural shock arrived in the summer of 2017. The summer of 2017 was the second year of below-average rainfall across the central sandhills, and the June soil moisture readings in Custer County came in at 31% of normal. Gus knew the grass. He had watched it since childhood, and he knew the deep-rooted species, the side oats, grama, and the buffalo grass, and the little bluestem that his grandfather's cattle had grazed on a rotational system. Before the word rotational was in common use on farms like his, the shallow-rooted annuals were already showing stress by the 1st of July. He pulled his stocking rate back in June, rotating his cattle to the eastern paddocks where he had let the grass rest since the previous October, and he reduced his sheep numbers by 20% by selling into the Kearney sale barn at $94 per head, which was below his target, but above what he would get if he held them into a drought. He had done this before, in 1999 and again in 2006. He did not enjoy it. He did the arithmetic. Ed Kurtz held his stocking rate through July. His lender had advised against early destocking because summer prices were favorable, and the extension service forecast was that the rainfall deficit would normalize by August. The forecast was wrong. August was the driest month in Custer County in 19 years. By September, Ed had sold half his calf crop at a distressed price of $168 per hundredweight against a break-even of $183, and he was sourcing supplemental hay at $210 per ton from an operation in the Sandhills that had reserve forage because it had been rested. The supplemental feed cost through the fall of 2017 ran Ed $44,000 against a projected budget of $9,000. His operating line at Farmer State Bank was extended by $38,000 at a new interest rate of 6.4%. This was not a catastrophe. It was a wound that did not close cleanly. Gus lost no cattle that summer. His sheep reduction had been planned and executed at above break-even prices. His pasture grass, managed for root depth by decades of rotational grazing, recovered by October in the paddocks he had rested. His bone broth production was unaffected by the drought because Pete Voss's facility operated on its own animal supply, and Gus had, beginning in 2014, arranged a supplementary bone supply from 2 additional USDA-certified facilities in Lincoln and Gothenburg, which gave him year-round volume stability independent of any single source. His 2017 annual broth revenue was $118,400 on direct-to-retail sales against a direct input cost of $29,700 and a labor estimate of $31,000 of his own time. The margin was not luxurious. It was real, and it was his, and it carried no debt service. By the winter of 2017, the term bone broth had arrived in mainstream grocery. Williams-Sonoma was stocking it. Whole Foods had a branded private label version on its shelves. The New York Times had run a piece on broth bars in Manhattan, where single servings were sold in paper cups for $5. The trade press was using the word trend. Gus read these articles with the particular quietness of a man who has been doing the thing being described as new for 18 years, and he did not write any letters to editors. What he did was call Nora. Nora Hamlin was 56 in 2017, retired from the Anselmo School District, and had been talking about her brother's broth to anyone who would listen since approximately 1999. She had given jars of it as Christmas gifts for so long that her friends and extended family treated a case of Hamlin Ranch broth as a reliable expectation rather than a surprise. When Gus called her in December of 2017 and said that the market was moving and that he might need help, she said she had been waiting for this call. She began handling his wholesale inquiry correspondence in January of 2018. Working from Gus's kitchen table with a laptop that Meg helped her set up. By March, she had a distribution agreement with a specialty food broker in Denver named Ruiz Provisions, run by a woman named Sol Ruiz who had found Gus through Vera's store and had been trying to get his wholesale attention for 2 years. Sol Ruiz was the qualified outside judge that every product like this one eventually requires. She was 41, had spent a decade sourcing for Whole Foods regionally before starting her own brokerage, and she knew what the company's quality standards required and how far most small producers fell short of them. She received a sample case from Gus in February of 2018 and opened a jar of the 24-hour cattle broth in her office kitchen in Denver. She did not warm it. She tilted the jar and watched how it moved, the way a person who knows collagen structure moves when she is looking for something specific. Then she opened the sheep broth. 22 hours, 14 bricks on the label, and she did warm that one. She stood at the counter and drank it from a ceramic mug and was quiet for a long time. She called Gus that afternoon and said she could not negotiate on the price because the price was already at the floor of what the product was worth, and that what she wanted to discuss was volume capacity. What Gus had built in the 18 months between Soul's call and the Whole Foods purchase order was not a scaling of the operation in the conventional sense. He did not build a commercial processing facility. He did not take on investors. He did not finance new equipment. What he did was formalize the network he had already constructed. That meant Pete Voss's facility for the primary bone supply, the Lincoln and Gothenburg operations for supplementary volume, a small USDA-certified processing space he leased 3 days per week from a local locker plant in Broken Bow that had excess capacity, and Nora and Meg handling correspondence and labeling while Gus managed production. He hired 2 part-time workers, both neighbors' adult children, at $16.50 per hour in the spring of 2019. He increased his jar inventory by purchasing a second-hand commercial jar washing unit from a canning operation in Columbus that was liquidating. The jar washer cost $4,200 used. He did not borrow money for it. The structural shock came for Ed Kurtz fully in the spring of 2019, 2 years after the drought had opened the wound. The operating line extension from 2017 had compounded. The 2018 cattle market had been soft, and Ed's margins had not recovered to the level required to service both his equipment note and the expanded operating line. In March of 2019, his lender called in a covenant review and found his debt service coverage ratio at 0.87, below the contractual threshold of 1.10. He was not in foreclosure. He was in the machinery that precedes it, meaning a forced asset sale conversation. An equipment auction date discussed but not yet set. A wife who had not slept well since October. Ed drove to Gus's place on a Thursday evening in April and sat at the kitchen table and said he was thinking of selling the East Quarter section, 97 acres at $2,100 per acre. He needed $203,700 to clear the covenant violation and extend the operating line on better terms. He said he was not looking for advice. He was just saying it out loud to someone who would understand. Gus listened. He did not offer advice. He asked Ed if he wanted coffee, and Ed said yes, and they sat there for a while. Moss was at Gus's feet under the table. The East Quarter section sold in June of 2019 to an outside investor at $2,050 per acre. Ed cleared $198,850, applied it to the operating line, and restructured with a lower covenant threshold. He was still farming. He had lost 97 acres. The drought had cost him, across 2 years of compounding interest and distressed sales and supplemental feed, something close to $280,000 in asset value and future income capacity. He was not ruined. He was smaller. And then came the phone call that Claire Dean made in the fall of 2020. She had been tracking Hamlin Ranch Broth through Saul Ruiz's brokerage since the fall of 2018, when Saul had placed the product in 4 independent specialty stores in the Denver metro area, and the sell-through rate had come back at 94% in the first 8 weeks, which was the number that put Hamlin on Claire's list. She had requested production documentation in the spring of 2019, specifically simmer time logs, bone source certifications from Pete Voss's facility, and the 2 supplementary operations, and Brick's test records going back 36 months. Gus had all of it. His grandmother's composition, notebook habit had shaped his own, and he had kept dated production logs since 2008, a practice he had begun without anyone telling him to, for the simple reason that he wanted to know if his gel strength varied by bone source or season, and the only way to know that was to write it down. Claire reviewed the documentation and made no requests for revision. This was unusual. Most small producers she worked with had gaps she had to ask them to fill. Gus's records were complete because completeness was how he thought about work, not because he anticipated her requirements. She called in October. She asked Gus how he would describe the difference between his broth and the nationally distributed brands already on Whole Food shelves. He said he did not know their products well enough to compare them directly, but that his broth was made from pasture-raised animals processed 6 miles from the farm, simmered for a minimum of 22 hours, never flavored, never diluted, and that the bricks reading on every jar corresponded to an actual test on that production batch, not an average. She said she understood. She said Whole Foods was looking to add a regional producer in the Rocky Mountain region who could supply 14 stores with consistent volume, and that what she was offering was a first-year shelf contract. Then she said the number, $312,000. It was a purchase order, not a guarantee. It was conditional on volume delivery and quality audits. Gus knew this. He had read the terms Sewell had forwarded the week before and had gone through them with Nora and Meg on 2 consecutive evenings before Claire called. He understood exactly what the number meant in terms of production capacity, delivery schedule, and the risk of a quality variance triggering a return. He set the phone down on the kitchen table. Moss stood up and pressed against his leg, and Gus put his hand on the dog's head, and the 2 of them stayed like that beside the table for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Nora was in the next room. She had heard the number. She did not come in. She understood that Gus would need a moment, and she gave it to him. The number landed in that kitchen with a force disproportionate to its size. It was not the largest sum of money in Custer County that fall. It was not even the largest transaction in Broken Bow that week. What made it land the way it did was the 11 years it had taken to accumulate the specific conditions that made it possible, namely the bone supply at no material cost, the production logs going back 12 years, the bricks testing protocol Vera had asked for in 2011, the distribution network Sewell had assembled, and the quality documentation Claire had found complete when she looked. Remove any single piece and the call does not happen. Remove the 11 years and there is no piece to remove. Dale Fitch heard about the Whole Foods contract through the Specialty Food Trade Press in early 2021. He was 56 by then, still working regional food distribution, and he was not a bad man. And what he felt when he read the item was not something he could have easily named. He drove out to Gus's place on a weekday in March of 2021, the first time he had been there since the 2015 visit, and Gus was in the yard repairing a fence section, and Nora was in the house, and Moss was barking once at the truck, and then going quiet. Fitch got out and said he had seen the news and that he owed Gus a better conversation than the one he had offered in 2009. Gus said he appreciated that. Fitch said he had spent some time thinking about what he had missed and why, and that he was curious, if Gus was willing, to understand the broth operation from the beginning, because he had clients in the region who were sitting on similar secondary product streams from their processing operations, and he did not want to tell them the wrong thing again. Gus said he would be happy to walk through it. He set down the fence pliers, and they went inside. That conversation in the kitchen in March of 2021 was the one that mattered more than the phone call in 2009, though it was quieter. Fitch asked questions and wrote things down. He asked about the bricks measurement, and Gus explained the refractometer and the number range and what it meant in terms of collagen hydrolysis, using the plain language he had built for himself over 18 years. He asked about the simmer time and whether longer was always better, and Gus said no, that above 28 hours the flavor began to develop a particular bitterness from the marrow fat oxidizing, and that the window between 22 and 26 hours was where the gelatin concentration peaked without the flavor loss. He asked about the bone source documentation, and Gus showed him the binder. When Fitch left, he stopped at the gate and said that he had told several producers over the years that their secondary processing work was not a viable business, and that he would like to revisit at least 2 of those conversations. Gus said that sounded like the right thing to do. Ed Kurtz came to Gus in the fall of 2021 with a question he had been turning over since July. He had a neighbor to his north, a smaller operation, whose owner had recently sold to a land investment company, and the fence line on that north boundary was in disrepair, and he was thinking about whether to lease the grazing rights for 2 seasons to recoup some of the ground he had effectively lost in 2019. He wanted to know what Gus thought about the lease terms. He also, partway through the conversation, said he had been thinking about the bones from Pete Voss's facility because he had heard that Gus was not taking all of them, and whether there was something he could start on a small scale while he rebuilt his balance sheet. Gus said there was. He told Ed to buy a 60-quart pot and a refractometer, and he gave him his grandmother's notebook, not the original, but a photocopy Meg had made and bound in a manila folder, with the composition notebook cover reproduced on the front. He said to start with 24-hour cattle, and not to rush the simmer, and to call him if the set was not coming right after the first 3 batches. By the spring of 2022, 12 producers in Custer County and 3 adjacent counties were making long-simmered bone broth from secondary bone supply at local processing facilities. 6 of them using the production log and bricks testing protocol that had originated in Gus's grandmother's kitchen and been formalized, iteration by iteration, over 23 years of mason jars and outdoor burners and a refractometer ordered from a catalog in Omaha. Gus had not organized a co-op or incorporated a training program. He had given each producer the photocopied notebook, his cell number, and 1 afternoon of his time in his own kitchen, and the rest they had done themselves, which is how he believed knowledge moved, if it was the right kind of knowledge. The Whole Foods contract renewed in 2021 and again in 2022, expanding to 22 stores. Gus did not expand his own production to fill the additional volume. He distributed the purchase order across 3 of the county producers who had adopted the protocol, identifying them to Sol Ruiz as qualified sources and having Sol negotiate the documentation requirements with Claire on their behalf. The per-jar margin he earned on his own production held at $3.40 net, above direct costs. He did not take a percentage of the neighboring producers' contracts. He did not see a reason to. The composition notebook lives in the kitchen drawer beside the stove where Gus's grandmother kept it, worn now to a softness that composition notebooks do not usually reach, the spine repaired twice with a strip of electrical tape his father had put there in 1986. The photocopy Meg made is in binders on a shelf in the least processing space in Broken Bow, and in kitchen drawers and on workshop shelves at 12 operations across 4 counties, each copy accumulating its own margin notes in the hand of whoever is working from it. The knowledge is not in any single place now, which is where it was always headed. Gus is 66 years old. He still runs the cattle and the hair sheep on the 340 acres outside Broken Bow. He still gets bones from Pete Voss's facility, which Pete's son Marcus now operates. He still drives the truck, which is a 2004 model now, bought used in 2009 for $7,400 and rebuilt once. Moss died in 2022, and Gus has a young healer named Birch, who presses against his leg when things change in a room and who has not yet learned that this is unusual behavior in a dog. The story Dale Fitch told himself in 2009 was a reasonable story. It matched the data he could collect and the category system he had been trained to apply, and it was wrong at the time horizon that mattered. Not because the data was false, but because the data was incomplete. What he could not measure in 2009 was the 11 years of production logs, the collagen chemistry of 22-hour simmering, the network of bone sources that removed Gus from the volatility of his own herd, the trust a refractometer, reading builds with a buyer like Claire Dean, who has been burned by products that claim quality they do not deliver. These things were not on the clipboard. They were not in the distribution channel. They were in the kitchen and in the binder and in the drawer beside the stove, and the only way to see them was to spend time in the same room with them. There are 2 ways to know a piece of ground. One is to drive past it and read the visible indicators: the soil color, the crop uniformity, the equipment in the yard, the condition of the fence. This is efficient knowledge. It is useful. It is almost always incomplete. The other way is to work the ground across decades, to measure the root depth in dry years and wet years, to read the species composition of the grass, and understand which roots go down 4 feet and which ones quit at 18 inches, to know that the knuckle joint from a pastured animal simmered for 24 hours produces a broth that sets at 14 bricks, and that the carton of stock on the shelf at $3.99 is not the same thing by any practical measure. This kind of knowledge cannot be brokered. It can only be learned or received from someone who learned it and wrote it down and left it in a drawer. What is rigid breaks. What belongs to the ground stays with it.